a very warm welcome to what promises to be a fascinating and illuminating event. My name, for those of you who haven't come across me before, is Monica Bohm-Duchin, as you can see on against my picture. But I'm the initiator and then the director of the Insiders Outsiders Festival, which, as some of you will know, was established primarily, or in the first instance, if I can put it that way, to pay homage to a particular generation of refugees. That's to say, those who fled here from Nazi persecution and came to these shores, mostly in the late 1930s, sometimes after the horrors of the Holocaust. But it was always my intention that actually our remit should be broader, that we would look both at the generations that came after, and indeed the generations that preceded the Jewish influx of the 1930s. And of course, this event very much fits into the latter category, and I'm very delighted that it's taking place in a week which, as many of you will be aware, is Refugee Week 2021, that is a nationwide endeavour. I will say, and you may already, well, perhaps have twigged, that Tessa Murdoch is not going to be our main speaker. I've put my screen on speaker view. Dinah Winch has very kindly agreed to take Tessa's place. Tessa was all set and ready to go as somebody who's indeed very much an expert on Huguenot culture in particular, but sadly had an accident and hurt her head, I believe, quite badly, so had to bow out rather at the 11th hour. And I'm terribly grateful to Dinah, and having spoken to Dinah in advance of this session, I have absolutely no doubt that we're in very good hands. So many thanks, Dinah, and thanks to you, Tessa, who is in the audience, for referring us to Dinah, and also for being in the audience to perhaps contribute at a later date. The main chair of this event is not going to be me. I'm not an expert on the Huguenots by any means, but Robert Winder, sorry, I keep forgetting Robert, it's Winder, isn't it? Yes.
Usually, but it doesn't matter.
I should know by now, shouldn't I? Robert Winder, who may be well known to many of you, but let me just say a little bit about him first of all. He was the literary editor of The Independent for 5 years and deputy editor of the illustrious Granta magazine, also in the late 1990s. He's the author of 3 novels, which is intriguing, several works of non-fiction, and has written numerous articles and book reviews in British and no doubt other periodicals. His latest book sounds fascinating, although it's not directly relevant to today's proceedings. It's on the issue of cultural diplomacy and is called Soft Power, the New Great Game, and was published just last year. But most relevantly here, of course, he's a trustee of the Migration Museum in London, and I'm hoping that there will be time for Robert to tell us a little bit more about that very important institution, and author of the brilliantly titled, tongue-in-cheek titled Bloody Foreigners, The Story of Immigration to Britain, published in 2004. And I, for one, find it a tremendously useful and rich and thought-provoking publication, which I always recommend to all my students, Robert, just so you know. Anyway, it's with great pleasure that I hand over now to Robert to chair this evening's event. Over to you, Robert.
Well, thank you very much, Monica, for those kind words, and congratulations for bringing all this together. Handling all the new technology is an especially demanding thing, I think, and I think you've done it incredibly bravely and well. I must say it's a great pleasure, it's a particular pleasure for me to join you tonight, partly because with my hat on as a trustee of the Migration Museum, obviously I'm very interested in both of your subjects, the migration from France of the Huguenots in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the Jewish migration later date that you've written about so well. And it's terribly important for us, I think, as a migration museum. We're a fledgling museum, and so it's going to be wonderful to be able to introduce and talk to Dinah tonight, because she's in many ways an inspiration to us, because hers is quite a new museum, a brilliant rendering of the Huguenot story. And that is one of the many stories that we hope to be able to tell in certain ways in our migration museum, which is going to look at both inward migration and outward migration. Our rough mantra is that we're all from somebody else, really. It just depends how far back you go. And our hope, and I think we'll be able to explore this a bit tonight, is that by looking at stories from the past, we can see without preaching the way in which they chime with and illuminate stories of the present. I mean, when we're talking about the Huguenot migration across the Channel, people stowing away on, in wine casks and coal scuttles, it's hard not to think of the people in the Channel this weekend, trying to risk everything in much the same way. And indeed, people all the way back to medieval times doing much the same thing. So it's also, I suppose this is the second reason why I'm so glad to be here tonight, because we're talking at a time when history is revealing itself to be something of an unexploded bomb in all our past, far from being a kind of done and dusted matter. We're being reminded in, I think, a very useful way that it's constantly being agitated by modern considerations, and we have to keep looking at it in new ways and thinking about it in new ways. Having said that, there's a risk sometimes, and I think in the present rather inflamed atmosphere, this sometimes happens, of looking at the past in a rather heroes and villains kind of way, putting it on trial, looking to name the guilty men. And while that's possible, I'm not sure it's always the most constructive thing. In my new book, which does have some relevance to this because it is a bit of a consideration of how national histories play out and clash on the international stage, I did interview the director of the British Museum, Hartwig Fischer, and he put it very clearly. He said, look, it's terribly important to revisit the past and to re-examine the past and to rethink the past. But we can't redo the past. We have to just inspect it as it was and try and inspect it in new ways and from new points of view. And that's all to be devoutly wished. But we have to do it sort of with good manners, because trying to use the past merely to stoke up contemporary rivalries won't really get us anywhere. That was his argument. I found it pretty convincing. But anyway, it gives me great pleasure now to hand over to Dinah, who I know there's going to be time for questions and answers from all of us later. And we want that to be as active as possible. But in the meantime, I hope she'll begin by just sketching in the background to the Huguenot story, the story of her museum. Later, I think we'll get on to what it's been like having a closed museum for the last year. And I know something about that too. So we can compare notes on that. But in the meantime, Dinah, please, just remind us all of what a moving and various story the Huguenot story is.
Right, thank you, Robert. I will just share my screen. There we go. Right, well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. We too are very inspired by the Migration Museum and very pleased to be part of a network of museums that are exploring these issues in many different ways, in different contexts. And though we look at this one group, the Huguenots, we do very actively see the Huguenots as part of that bigger picture and try to talk about that bigger picture wherever we can. So the opportunity to talk to you this evening is something I'm particularly looking forward to. For those of you that haven't been to the Huguenot Museum, and I expect there might be a few, this is the view that you see from the train from London to the seaside. I don't blame you for staying on the train and going to the beach, but at some point do step off and come and see beautiful historic Rochester and the Huguenot Museum. We were opened in 2015 by Princess Alexandra. And we were funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and we're just coming up to our 6th birthday, though of course, like everybody else, we've lost a year and a bit. I'm going to give you, as Robert suggested, I'm going to give you a brief outline of the story that we tell at the museum through a series of key objects, and how that story is shaped by the history of the Huguenot Museum itself, and what light it might shed on how this group of immigrants have defined their own history to some extent, their legacy, and what their relevance is today. I'm sorry I'm not Tessa, but there will be opportunities to hear from Tessa later in the year when we celebrate the launch of Tessa's fabulous new book on refugee art and culture later on in the year, and I'm sure she will contribute this evening as well. So you enter the Huguenot Museum through the Medway Visitor Information Centre, where you meet an artist's impression of Huguenot refugees escaping their homeland and arriving in Britain. You'll also see, I haven't got a picture, but you'll also see when you come in an image of a silversmith and an image of the weaver, the two images of the Huguenots in most people's minds. I think actually many people sometimes don't think of them looking like refugees, but think of them as the successful migrants that they became. And weavers and silversmiths are the two things that people know. You also can't help but notice this design everywhere on the outside and inside of the building. It's from an original 18th century silk design by James Lemon, which is the red image on the left. And then it's been transformed into the various blue images that you see around the museum and in our shop. Again, reflecting the significance in most people, the recognition factor, I suppose, with silk weaving. We find, in fact, that very few people really know very much about the Huguenots, particularly in France. So we start the museum in this room with its rather evocative blood red walls, which starts off with explaining the history of the Huguenots in France. So the Huguenots were, as I'm sure most of you know, were French Protestants who were persecuted for their religion from the early days of the Reformation until the French Revolution, when Protestantism ceased to be outlawed. They're followers of one of the key figures of the Reformation, John Calvin, who is of course French and exiled to Geneva. Now this print is a print of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, which is another one of the key moments in history that we find that a lot of people have heard of. As you may know, or many of you will know, that it happened as a result of the wedding between the Protestant Prince Henry of Navarre and the Catholic Princess Margaret, sister of the king, in an attempt to bring the warring factions in the French wars of religion together. And an attempt made on the life of Admiral Gaspard de Coligny led to the massacre of many thousands of Protestants in Paris and beyond, and was crucially for our story one of the early big triggers that triggered refugees leaving France and coming to look for safety beyond the shores of France. So it's a key kind of starting point in the story of the Huguenots in the museum. This is our famous Bible baked in a loaf of bread, our most Instagrammed object, I think, as well. So a very key object for us. I'll tell you a bit more about the baking in a moment, but it was printed in 1588 and is a Protestant Bible. So it's written in the vernacular French rather than in Latin, and we deliberately have it open on a page where the French is very clearly visible. And it's an object that is an important insight into the experience of being a persecuted minority in France at the time. According to family tradition, the title page of the Bible was removed to protect the identity of the printer. Now, in 1598, Henry IV, who had survived the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and had subsequently become King of France, having renounced his Protestantism, gave Huguenots a level of toleration with the Edict of Nantes of 1598, and the number of refugees leaving France reduced significantly. We have to jump very swiftly over many decades of fraught and tumultuous French and English history before we come to the 1680s. And again, the Bible takes center stage in the story. For Louis XIV stepped up his attack on the Huguenots with a campaign of aggressive billeting of soldiers in Protestant households. They not only made their presence extremely unpleasant, but the idea of billeting soldiers was partly one to break the Protestants financially as well, because the householders were responsible for the board of the soldiers and their horses. And incidentally, they were called the Dragonade, and incidentally that brought the word dragoon into the English language. The idea was to force them into Catholicism. And the story is that the family who owned this Bible saw the soldiers coming and hid their precious family Bible in the dough waiting to go into the bread oven in their house, thereby saving the Bible. But you can probably see even on the screen the water damage and singeing and general kind of wear and tear that this precious book has suffered. as a result of its being saved in the bread oven. Incidentally, this is not the only Protestant Bible that had this fate. There is another Bible in the United States which has a very, very similar story, and there's a blog on our website that brings the two stories together. In 1680, the Dragonade started in 1681, and then in 1685, Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes, and it became illegal overnight to be a Protestant. The ministers were given 2 weeks to leave and were forced to leave, while the laity were compelled to stay. And the idea was, obviously, by getting rid of the clergy, that the laity would fall into line. People were forced to convert or ended up in prison. Women and girls might be forced into convents, and men possibly into the galley ships. So from 1681, Huguenots started to leave France again in large numbers, and this accelerated after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. So that's the introduction that we give. We have very little in the way of objects to tell the story of escape. So again, we return to illustrations on the wall to explain this story. And then there's a map. Around about this point, when you're taking somebody around, they always ask you about the numbers. And here is the map to give you the numbers. The research has changed in the sort of 5 or 6 years that we have been open, and Robin Gwynn and scholars in the Netherlands have brought down the numbers of the Huguenots that went to the Dutch Republic, I should say, and reinforced the research that around 50,000 Huguenots came to England during the reign of Louis XIV. The map also shows 3,500 to America and 400 to South Africa, something that, again, our visitors are very rarely aware of unless they have been looking into the Huguenots specifically. This is a print of the Charenton Temple outside Paris. Part of Louis XIV's campaign was to order the destruction of Huguenot temples, and this was a very iconic example. And this print was made in 1708 and was reprinted in London by a society set up by former members of that temple. And they were supposed to live within 3 miles of Christ Church in Spitalfields. And next to it's one of my favourite objects, which is an embroidery clearly directly based on this print. Unfortunately, we don't know who made it. It's in the collection of the French Hospital, and I'm told that it was found stuffed behind a radiator and rescued and restored and put on display in the museum. But sadly, that history means that we don't know exactly who made it. We then take people through to the history of the French Hospital. And this is very important to understanding what the Huguenot Museum does and doesn't tell you about the story of the Huguenots, because the majority of items on display come from the French Hospital's collection. And the origins of the French Hospital are this man on the left. So accompanying William and Mary in 1688, when they came over in the Glorious Revolution, were 3 regiments of Huguenot soldiers. And amongst them was the man on the left, Jacques De Gatini, whose bequest led to the establishment of the French Hospital. We in fact know very little about him. He gained British citizenship on the 31st of March, 1690, and a few months earlier, he'd fought alongside William III at the Battle of the Boyne, along with many other Huguenot soldiers, obviously seeing the defeat of James II, who was supported by the French. In 1698, Gatini was appointed Master of the King's Harthounds and Buckhounds, and he died in November 1708, only 3 months after writing his will in French. His executor was the man on the right, Philippe Ménard, and in the will, he stated that he would give £500 to the pest house to build some apartments there to lodge some poor, infirm, or sick French Protestants above the age of 50 years, and the woman or maiden the same. His will stated there should be lodgings for at least 12 people, and he left a fund to provide for the ongoing furnishing of beds and linens and clothes and other necessities of the poor French Protestants. The funds were put in the hands of the French Committee, which was a committee distributing the royal bounty. Now, this was an extraordinary fund which raised huge amounts of money to support Huguenot refugees in England. It included funds directly from the civil list, so it involved, there was a degree of royal and state sanctioning and welcoming of the Huguenots to this country, and then supporting them when they got here. The funds were also raised from collections in church and more broadly. And what's very interesting about the fund is that it was given over to this French committee partly to this French committee made up of actual Huguenots to distribute the fund to their own community and allocate it as they thought appropriate. And the Royal Bounty Archive has been digitized by the Huguenot Society from original documents found in over 50 boxes found in the cellars of the French hospital back, I think, in the 1930s. And these documents are now available online and are very useful to people researching their family history as well as the history of the Huguenots more generally. And they had the Huguenots had a very long tradition of independent organization of charitable support as a result of their history dispersed across Europe and needing to develop these networks of support to support each other. Gatini's plan was that the pest house, which had looked after people during the plague just a few decades earlier, would be extended to support the Huguenots. But in fact, that didn't happen. And a new plot of land, the money was invested, and a few years later, a new plot of land at a place called the Golden Acre near Old Street became available, and the owners sold it at a peppercorn rent. And here we have a receipt from 58 years later, when 58 peppercorns were due, and this is in the collection of the Huguenot Library. So large amounts of money were raised from the Huguenot community, English nobility, and more broadly, so that a completely new building was able to be built. And the first governor was the man on the right, the Earl of Galway, who was a French Protestant who'd also fought at the Battle of Boyne and had become commander-in-chief of the English forces in Ireland. So you see this very rapid entry into the highest levels of English society. The first 37 directors were all prosperous merchants, professional men, clergy, master craftsmen, reflecting that speed with which a certain section of the Huguenot community settled in for the establishment. So down at the bottom on the left, you've got Sir John Ligonier, later Field Marshal and Earl, who became governor of the French hospital in 1948. He'd left France as a 17-year-old, settling initially in Dublin, joined the British Army and became commander-in-chief during the 7 Years' War, which started in 1756. The painting is by Philip Mercier, who was the son of a tapestry weaver, travelling through Europe before settling in England in 1716. And in 1729, he was appointed principal painter to Frederick, Prince of Wales. And in the middle there is another Lieutenant General, Louis de Jonge, who was a friend of Ligonier, became a director of the French hospital as well. Here we have the earliest picture of the French hospital from 1756, which was illustrated in William Maitland's famous History of London. All sorts of extensions had been built by this point to improve the accommodation, particularly providing accommodation for the mentally ill. And the French hospital was very progressive, uniquely progressive in this respect. Unlike some of the other hospitals, there was no sort of public viewing and sort of indignity involved in their care. And one of the most notable inmates was the remarkable Huguenot ivory carver, David Le Marchand. And this is an ivory carving that he did of Matthew Raper, which is in the Victoria and Albert Museum. He came to the French hospital completely destitute, despite his network of extraordinary patrons who had commissioned his work. And sadly, there's nothing in the French hospital collection, there's none of his work because of the nature of his relationship with the French hospital. So we would love at some point to have a Le Marchand object in our collection, but the record of his coming into the French hospital describes him as an ingenious man for working in ivory. And Maitland describes the fact that the charity also extends to lunatics whom accommodation in a large infirmary is provided, and describes the development of the French hospital in very favourable terms. Oh, I didn't mean to go back there actually, sorry. We'll come to, oh no, I'm going forward. I'm not sure how to go backwards. No. Sorry. I'm just going to have to go back to do this to go backwards. Right. there we go, back on track. So Gatini had said that people should be over 50. In fact, that rule wasn't kept to. There was a child of 10 admitted who spent the 29 years of his life there. Many were sailors and soldiers serving in the British Navy and Army. And so it very much reflects the nature of what was going on at the time in terms of who was admitted into the hospital at that time. Certainly the records we have give some insight into the horrors of the persecution. So we have one man who'd been a pastor, escaped illegally, and had lost his mind when he came to England. Another 4 are admitted in the 1730s, having served time in the French galleys. Others had escaped from prison. One man left behind his wife and 4 children. There's very much a sense among people who visit the museum that the Huguenots are this uniquely skilled and successful group of immigrants. And while there is, of course, a great deal of truth to that, many of the Huguenots immigrants were very poor. Some were poor when they left France. Some had to leave with nothing, came penniless, with no means of earning a living, and others were broken by the experience of their escape and unable to work once they got here. And again, Robin Gwynne, the great historian of the Huguenot experience in England, has done a lot of work recently on the extent to which there was a much higher level of poverty amongst the Huguenot refugees than is sometimes assumed. And while we have no objects on display in the museum relating to the residents of the hospital, we do know from the vast amounts spent through the Royal Bounty and through other charitable foundations that many Huguenots were in financial distress for a considerable amount of time. And we have an alms box and a donor board in the museum to represent this huge effort in raising money to support this group of refugees. So I've talked a little bit about some of the things that you won't see, some of the things that are missing, but what will you see? We're going in the right direction. On the left is a pair of silver sugar casters, which bear the maker's mark of the Huguenot silversmith Thomas Beverell for 1714-15. The directors of the hospital dined on pewter plates and used silver cutlery. So this set of 3-pronged forks was made in the 1720s, and each one is inscribed French Hospital. And I hope you can see on the casters, it's also inscribed French Hospital. The set is still complete and is still used by the directors at their regular lunches. There is, of course, no sense of the museum of the hospital putting together a collection at this stage. These items were commissioned for use by the directors, who were at this point men of distinguished rank within the Huguenot community and increasingly wider British society. Here we have 2 silver communion cups, and there are several groups of church plate in the museum that come in through various routes. But these were originally given to the French church in Hoxton in 1717, and the inscriptions tell you this. And then when the church in Hoxton closed in 1790, they were given to the hospital. And this represents an important process in the trajectory of the Huguenot experience in England, which was the assimilation of the Huguenot community, originally Calvinist religious refugees, assimilation into the Anglican Church. So in 1700, there were sort of around 30 French churches in London alone, and yet by the end of the 18th century, nearly all of these churches had closed for a variety of reasons to do with the process of assimilation. And that's the point at which some of the silver comes into the French hospital. So as the 18th century draws to a close, things are changing. The persecution has become a dim memory for most, and the Huguenot community is assimilating both into church and society. The aftermath of the French Revolution brings a new set of French refugees, and the sympathy this time is for Catholic refugees escaping the aftermath of the revolution. Between 1792 and 1802, 12,000 French priests sought refuge in England. And this man on the right is a Catholic priest who converted to Anglicanism and was hired as a chaplain at the French hospital in the early 19th century and was its last French-speaking chaplain. And this question, which faces many immigrants, is the process of where you use English and where you use your mother tongue, and in what context you retain the use of the mother tongue and in what context you very rapidly pick up English is one which I think is an interesting one to track in the Huguenot community. And to some extent, it can be traced through the records of the French hospital. So, for example, the minutes of the French hospital are kept in French until into, I think it's around the 1830s, they start being kept in English. And I'll take you back briefly to the early 18th century, because this is a very pertinent issue for the early 18th century as well. This is a prayer book printed in 1729 by the Huguenot printer Nicolas Prévost, and it's the English Book of Common Prayer, but in French. So there's a great deal of wrangling in the 17th century about the liturgy and about religious conformity. In the 1630s, Archbishop Laud is very keen that the Huguenots conform to Anglicanism, and the issue of Presbyterianism, Calvinism, episcopal control, all of those things are, of course, things that feed very much into the conflicts that led to the English Civil War. But the stranger churches, as they were called, were considered a problem by Laud and some other people in the Anglican hierarchy. And later on in the 17th century, when the Huguenots are coming in large numbers and are being welcomed largely by Charles II, by James II even, and later William and Mary, there is very much a sense that it is important to a greater or lesser degree that the Huguenots conform to the Anglican Church. And there are restrictions on the licensing of new Huguenot communities so that they need to conform to Anglicanism. And so here we have that made flesh, if you like, in this particular book, which is the Anglican liturgy, but in French, so that people continue to worship in their own tongue, even if the nature of that worship has changed in their new country. Now, Spitalfields, of course, the change. This is the thing about the Huguenots, that most people know something about the importance of the Huguenots to the silk industry. The changing fortunes of the silk industry meant that the French hospital still had a role to play, even though the place of the Huguenots in English society is changing. The glorious silk designs by Lemon, who we mentioned at the beginning, first of Canterbury and then at Spitalfields, were the peak of fashion and sophistication. And the Huguenots had transformed the English silk industry with their technical know-how, their new designs, but also their business skills. And we have very little in the collection to represent this, which is why I'm showing you pictures from the V&A. But the story of the French hospital in the 19th century brings a new dimension to the story of the French hospital and silk and the Huguenot community. This is just a view of our gallery, and you can see at the front some fragments of silk, which I'll now show you in more detail. So in the 19th century, the economics of the international textile trade and changing fashion fatally undermined the English silk industry. There was competition from woven silks from France, painted silks from China, the changing fashion for lighter muslins, and the new fashion for printed designs on cotton. So these heavy woven silk brocades that the Huguenots had been known for were no longer fashionable and desirable, and this caused the Spitalfields silk industry over quite a considerable period of time to collapse. And increasingly, the residents of the French hospital were silk workers fallen on hard times. So here we have a petition to the hospital, again now in the Huguenot Library, from William Akers in 1845, who was born in Spitalfields, the grandson of someone called Alexander Bernonville, who had escaped from France at the time of the persecution of the Protestants in the reign of Louis XIV. The petition says he originally worked as a weaver, but that business declining took to his present employment of drawing patterns for embroidery, which he pursued for 50 years, but foreign patterns superseding the English could no longer earn sufficient to support himself. We have silk samples from Sarah Burton at the front, at the bottom of the slide, who suffered from badness of trade and ill health, and was in the French hospital from 1884 until her death in 1901. And behind the beautiful blue and gold silk from Ruth Marmoy, whose great-grandfather, again recorded in the records of the French hospital, came from France to escape the persecution on account of his religion. So we have lots of records relating to the residents, but these objects are rare survivals. In the middle of the 19th century, the original French hospital building was run down and neglected, and a new, rather extravagant building was built in Hackney in Victoria Park, which opened in the 1860s. This new hospital was state-of-the-art with hot water apparatus for heating the rooms, and considerable comforts. Though the Huguenot community, that recognized itself as Huguenot, if you like, was declining, because descendants were losing touch with their original ancestry, there were 60 inmates in the building. And in 1875, the charity commissioners observed that the hospital was a handsome building, too handsome indeed for the purpose with which it was designed, the board and lodging of aged weavers and weaveresses. And these are some Victorian illustrations of some of the residents. But a sense of Huguenot community identity was also changing in the later 19th century. As early as 1810, the French hospital had referred to the fact in its statute book that it should be maintained as a monument to the piety of their ancestors. And part of a sort of growing confidence around this issue of identity is represented by that new building, but also a sense of the growing idea that the hospital was a repository for the memory of the community and for celebrating their contribution to English society. And on the right, you've got Arthur Browning, who asked his fellow directors, who was the secretary of the French hospital, asked his fellow directors to donate things that were relevant to their history and contribute to a fund to enable them to purchase items of historical importance. And this was the beginning of what we now think of as the French hospital collection. So we've got Sir Henry Austen Layard here, who with Browning established the Huguenot Society in 1885. And there's an early Huguenot Society certificate, which is on display in the museum. And their aim was to encourage academic inquiry and particularly to develop genealogical research and do that research into the community. And there was growing Victorian interest in the Huguenots as well. Samuel Smiles had published his book on the Huguenots in 1867. In 1885, the French hospital and the Huguenot Society led the commemorations for the bicentenary of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, in direct contrast to 100 years earlier, when the centenary of the revocation had passed without, as far as we can tell, any comment at all or commemoration. And this growing sense of commemorating the history is very visible in the collection. So we have a tankard here, which is dated 1685. It was made in 1685, but it was given to the French hospital by a director, Henry Peake, because it was the date of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. You've got the flagon on the right, which was commissioned and given to celebrate the opening of the new chapel in the 1860s. So new silver coming in. And then in 1901, you've got the cigarette box given by Browning, and inset in it are medals relating to Huguenot history. So you've got medals of Louis XIV and William and Mary. And in the same spirit, we've got a cup by the distinguished Huguenot descendant goldsmith George Lambert, and you can see at the front there again a medal, a historical medal of William and Mary. Other key figures in history feature on that cup, and these medals by Lambert are worn by the governor and deputy governor of the French hospital. The portraits I showed you earlier were not commissioned by the hospital at the time, but were bought later as the French hospital was bringing in objects and images that reflected their history. And these two portraits of director Peter Le Herp and his wife Clara, again, didn't enter the collection in 1747 when they were painted, but later in the 19th century as part of this process. Sorry, the image is jumping ahead a little bit, but in the 20th century, the French hospital was concerned that the London County Council was going to want to compulsorily purchase the building. And you start getting really interesting documents outlining the significance of the hospital. Again, Browning refers to the problem of losing not only the home for the old people, the residents, but also the home for our invaluable collection of Huguenot relics. The deputy governor reminded the London County Council that the museum was an outstanding memorial of the settlement of the Huguenots who had enriched the country in the arts, sciences and industries. It was a treasure house of memorials to past Huguenots, and its unique building was becoming more and more the centre of research into Huguenots. And in 1938, another director stated that the French hospital was not only a hospital, it is the Huguenot Museum. So leaping ahead very quickly, the French hospital moves to Rochester in the 1950s, and now is not the time to go into exactly why that is. And then the directors of the French hospital set the Huguenot Museum up, and there we are, a few doors down from the French hospital as it is now on Rochester High Street. And here you see those objects that have come through to the museum from the French hospital. So what do we as a museum do now? Because as I've highlighted through the talk, there are gaps in our story. You know, we don't tell the story of Spitalfield silk terribly well, for example, because we don't have those objects. So one of the things that we're trying to do is fill some of those gaps to tell the broader story. And so here, for example, we were very generously donated these two portraits of Anne Courtauld, of the famous first goldsmith family and then later textiles, and her husband, the goldsmith John Jacob. And those will hopefully be conserved and go on display soon. We have on loan this beautiful tea caddy in the centre by Eliza Godfrey, woman Huguenot silversmith, and Anne Tanqueray, the first known Huguenot woman silversmith, which we bought with very generous donations a couple of years ago. And we were then donated some Spitalfield silk woven in the 1760s, which again, we hope to put on display soon. It's not on display yet. We also make a connection in the museum with the broader picture of the history of refugees to this country. So of course, as I'm sure many of you know, the word refugee was coined to describe the Huguenots in the 1680s. And here on a wall in the museum, we look at several of the other major groups of refugees that have come to this country since then. And through the museum, there is interpretation from refugees, texts around the museum from refugees that were designed as part of a project when the museum opened, and are a very moving connection between the Huguenot refugees and the refugees of the present. We have done several projects with mostly young people, unaccompanied young people. This was a project with young people from the Red Cross and was a painting made in sand of the experience of a young refugee who was brought by people traffickers through the desert in North Africa, and was on display early on in the early days of the museum. More recently, we showed pots by the artist Claudia Clare, telling the story of Hossein Shahabi, who you see there, who is a Kurdish refugee from Iran. And this pot tells the story of his escape. And another pot in the exhibition showed his experience of aspects of his experience of his first experience of London, particularly of Trafalgar Square, when he moved here. And interestingly, I've just discovered that another pot about him by Claudia is on display at Kent University in an undergraduate exhibition at the moment. We've had Phosphorus Theatre come and do a performance in the museum, and they then did a workshop with young refugees through a charity called Kent Kindness, which is what you see here. We also have done a whole series of workshops for adults as well as young people, exploring the legacy, the design, and art and craft legacy of the Huguenots. This was a particularly lovely repeat pattern workshop that was done. And then this was a project that was done in 2019 with a modern silk weaver, Hannah Robson, who, as well as showing her contemporary contemporary weaving, she also did a project inspired by the objects in our collection. There's the 1685 tankard again. That's our Spitalfield silk, actually from the back, because it's the construction of the silk that inspired Hannah. And so we showed the silk the wrong way round. And she and Hannah created another 6 works, hand woven and jacquard woven of fabrics inspired by the Huguenot legacy. And there you see a detail of one of them on the left. And so we do have an ongoing program of contemporary craft engagement as well, inspired by that legacy. And I'll just finish with an image of our volunteer Alan, who features in many of our TripAdvisor reviews from grateful visitors who he has helped with their family history, talking through family history with a visitor in our archive room. So I'll stop there, Robert. That's a little quick whiz through some of the things that we're doing more recently.
Well, thank you very much, Dinah. If technology allowed it, you'd hear an enthusiastic burst of warm applause echoing through the hall right now before we slope off for a glass of white wine at the back.
Yes.
But we're going to keep you there, I think. And I've already seen various messages trickling along, most of which have the word fascinating in them. And I would ask the audience to do write in your questions. I think Monica is going to be keeping an eye on those questions, and so we'll come to them. And in the meantime, I have a few questions of my own, so we'll begin talking. And
Robert, if I could, sorry, rather rudely interrupt, could we
yes,
ask Dinah to stop screen sharing, and then actually
Certainly.
audience
Yeah.
can actually, I'll highlight both of you so that you're
Done that.
immediately visible.
thank you. Superb technical skills, Monica. I mean, and so then we'll involve as many people as we can as time goes by. But as everyone is saying, Dinah, that was all fascinating. And I was going to begin by asking you what you learned in your time at the museum about storytelling through objects. But I find myself more interested in what you were saying at the end about finding ways to tell stories without objects. And I suppose that chimes with our experience, because we don't have the Cutty Sark or the Elgin marbles or anything. And so what you're doing there creatively to, in a way, manufacture your own objects. I mean, those vases looked absolutely wonderful. I haven't seen those before. And has that been an exciting thing for you? And what has been for you the highlight of that process of trying to create your own storytelling content without, you know, the Mona Lisa?
You're referring to the big vases of Hussein's
Yes.
story, for example. Yeah, I think it was very important for us that the Huguenot legacy was a living legacy, and that legacy, you know, there are two obvious streams. One is the connecting the refugee story, and the other is developing and keeping those craft skills alive, and making sure that the story of these refugees and others. I mean, we always encourage people to think more broadly as well, that as I say, that it's a living legacy, and so there's very vivid opportunities to continue to create and engage, because people engage in different ways, don't they? And so this is such a great opportunity to enable people to engage with history, either with the object specifically in the way that Hannah Robson did. That was the first project we had done in that way, where we had somebody come in and study the objects in the store and in the gallery, and then go away and create new work. And there are added dimensions to that, in that the company, some of the work was hand woven, some of it was using the skills specifically that the Huguenots used to make their brocades, a particular weaving skill called lampas, and she did a fantastic workshop, which actually I took part in. And it's incredibly complicated and extraordinary to do lampas weaving. And then she also worked with a silk weaver called David Walters in Sudbury, which is a town in Suffolk that has the four main silk weavers still going in England, all operate out of Sudbury. Walters actually doesn't have Huguenot ancestry, but would have worked with, you know, the Huguenot community. So there's so many layers of history there, which is really exciting.
Sudbury also has Gainsborough, I think.
Exactly, Gainsborough, Richard Humphrey, yes, indeed, as in Gainsborough the artist, yes. Yes, so much going on in Sudbury.
But in a way that's relevant, because I mean, what I suppose I was interested in there is how exciting have you found it asking modern artists to have a conversation with the origins of this story, with the history, and you get something quite new out of it. I mean, in our case, we had an exhibition, which I think you know of, which was of the Sangat refugee camp, and we did commission artists to come up with things. And The most wonderful one was in a way like a found piece, an installation. And it was just a collection of life jackets hanging on hooks. But in fact, they were death jackets because they were fake and they'd been stuffed with newspaper and cardboard. So they would sink, they would drown you if you fell in the water with one of those on. And they'd been stamped with reputable commercial names and sold. And people bought them in good faith, but they were death jackets. So it's just a nice invitation for the likes of you and us to see what we can come up with, I think, artistically, to tell those stories that you're already telling very well.
And they bring in new visitors. This is the key thing. So we bring in people for Hannah. We also had Margot Selby, the weaver, who did a show. You know, that brings in people who come in who are interested in craft or contemporary art or whatever, and they come to those stories newly. And you know, we hear again and again and again in the museum, through every different angle we take on the story, we will hear people say, I had never realized the connection between the modern refugee crisis and the past, and you know, history repeating itself, and recognizing that history doesn't exactly repeat itself, that there are of course differences, but it brings new people into that story going back, which is so important to our understanding of Britishness and understanding of how this nation is ongoing, is created. And this is such a good way of bringing people in.
Yes. The other thing you referred to in that, which I also thought was incredibly relevant, was the idea of there being a trajectory. You spoke about the enormous number of churches that there were at the beginning of the 18th century, but by the end of the 18th century, they'd largely closed down and been absorbed into the Anglican community. But of course, the Huguenot refugees and their families weren't just doctrinally different. It wasn't just a certain kind of Protestantism. They were also French. And so they had kind of national bonds as well as religious bonds. And so there are all kinds of different ways of assimilating and not assimilating. And were you implying there that 100 years is about how long it takes for that journey to complete between the original adventure and the difficulty and the friction and the settling in and the effort and the striving, and then successful assimilation in a lot of cases and impoverishment in some other cases, but then the gradual integration into the community? And is it your view that it takes about 100 years?
Oh, now that wasn't my implication at all.
No, I know, it's just interesting to spectate on that.
No, it is. But
actually really what happens after 100 years, you seem to be suggesting, is you then get a rediscovery of the heritage. And people become interested in it again, in a way, in a slightly less connected way, but an equally intense one.
I mean, you know, there's no rules about this, are there? I mean, it's certainly, I think assimilation is easier if you're white, isn't it? So it's easier for the Huguenots. I mean, you know, it's far more complicated if you're not white. And so I think that process takes longer and goes through many different fluctuations for different groups of immigrants, doesn't it?
Yes.
I think certainly I find really interesting about the Huguenots is this intense rediscovery of identity that seems to happen in the late 19th century. And I think it probably there are people in the audience, I can see names I recognize, who could speak much more wisely than I about how that process has taken place in other places, notably the United States, for example. There certainly is a growing, there's certainly a very strong desire that we sense from many of the visitors coming in, that people want to be Huguenots. Owen Stanwood, who wrote an excellent book about the Huguenots in the British Empire, was part of a really interesting conversation, which I recommend, on the program called The Forum, which you can find on the iPlayer. And he refers to, again, this impulse in the United States where people want to find Huguenot ancestry. So they make Davy Crockett a Huguenot, and he's not at all. You know, so it's a very interesting process, isn't it, about which that kind of romanticization as well that happens. And
as someone has observed, it depends on numbers too, doesn't it? Because it was quite a small number that went to America. So I think we can think that Michael Jordan probably wasn't a Huguenot, however much people might wish he had been.
But of course, there are quite a few people of mixed race in the United States who have Huguenot origins. Du Bois is the classic example of that.
And what feedback are you getting from that family ancestry strand? You said you had a brilliant volunteer who helps people for a modest fee research their own family ancestry. I did that once with a little DNA test. And it was done with the Science Museum, and we all regathered to have the results. And of course, we were all secretly hoping we would discover exactly which branch of a kind of Ethiopian warrior or a Maori prince that we belonged to. In my case, it just sort of nailed down the precise piece of bagshot that it turned out I'd fetched up in. But that's a very popular strand for people, isn't it? And are you getting a lot of good feedback from that and people's interest in their own family roots?
Well, it's a fantastic process for us in lots of ways, because we learn a lot from people because they bring in research that they've done as well. So it's a very mutually beneficial process, but also it can be quite emotional. That, as I say, there can be this very strong desire that people really want their ancestors to be Huguenots and want them to be a certain type of Huguenot. You know, they want them to be silk weavers. And it can sometimes be quite emotional if we discover that they weren't Huguenots at all, that it's a family history that's got a bit mangled down the line, or that they were French but not Huguenots, because of course the French have been coming forever. And sometimes they're quite excited to find out that they were sort of, and their ancestor is a Norman nobleman from further back. But it can be it can be very interesting, the expectations that people bring in sometimes, and the excitement they get from discovering, you know, where people lived and what they did, and immediately making connections with things in their own lives today. You know, if they're creative or if they're interested in textiles or something, it gives a sort of great sense of meaning to that, which can be very interesting. So yeah, from a museum perspective, it's a fantastic way of engaging with audiences. Again, it's often the impetus that brings people to come to us.
I was going to just mention there the program, of course, Who Do You Think You Are? And I think most famously Derek Jacobi discovering his Huguenot ancestry. But in fact, this very day, we've had another inquiry. There's another program in the making with two Huguenot families at its heart. So that, of course, is a wonderful way of, explaining the role of the Huguenot Museum in helping people to discover their Huguenot ancestry, and indeed, of course, the society as well.
Yes, and of course,
it's fantastic to see you looking so well.
Yes, I've been.
If you could just talk for another 40 minutes on art and the refugee experience.
I will when called. But I would like to thank Dinah for stepping into the breach with such alacrity and delivering such a fascinating talk. And I think it's so timely, given that the Huguenot Museum has been closed for most of the last year and will be reopening, I think, one day a month. Even without an appointment. So the very first Saturday of July, I think it's July the 3rd.
That's right.
Yes. I know there are one or two people who've said tonight, oh, they're longing to come to the museum. So there you are. You can go. It's going to be open, despite.
What is your strategy for reopening, actually, Dinah?
Well, at the moment,
there's a few Saturdays named on your website. But
that's right. At the moment, we're saying first Saturday of the month, from the 3rd of July, August, September are the dates that we've specified. We're also going to have some tour days. We've been waiting for the announcement yesterday before we announce those, because of course the regulations determine whether we can have 6 or more people, which include tours of the French hospitals. So I do encourage people to sign up to those when they're advertised. The first ones are going to be full of people who unfortunately were postponed from the first lockdown, when we had to, abruptly stop what we were doing. So there's quite a few people stacked up for tours initially. And unfortunately, we've had an unexpected, our other member of staff had to leave unexpectedly. So that has changed our plans. So that's why we're being a little bit slow to advertise exactly what we're doing, because I need to sort it all out. But we will have a fantastic program of Zoom talks starting from next month as well. And of course, later on, I hope Tessa will be doing Zoom and in-person events relating to the new book as well. So though you've not heard her very much this evening, you will have that opportunity to hear about all this latest research into Huguenot and culture later. I did just want to say in relation to the family history that of course we're very dependent on the records of the Huguenot Society, which I mentioned was set up in the 1880s and have done this incredible work in transcribing all these records that are now available to us all to do this family research. And the Huguenot Library, I believe, is now open again so that people can go and do their own research as well. But we've also had some very emotional experiences where people have discovered that they are related to people whose portraits are in the museum. And we had one woman come in who wasn't expecting to see herself face to face with her ancestors. She'd only just discovered that they were she was of Huguenot descent. So she came to us to kind of find out a bit more. And there she was face to face with her ancestors, and she burst into tears and had not been expecting that at all. So it can be a very emotional experience for people.
That's what we find very compelling as well. It's something that happens. I mean, you think you're looking at an 18th century salt cellar, and in fact you're triggering all kinds of strong emotions today.
Yeah.
What kind of a take up and interest do you get from schools? It's something we're certainly looking to develop, and I know you're working a bit with us on that. How does that work for you?
I'm going to give a rather museumy answer.
I mean, these are not normal times, obviously. But,
yeah, well, of course, interestingly, I'm teaching on Zoom next week with a local school, which I'm really looking forward to, which I hope will be the start of actually making it easier to get over some of those logistical problems. I mean, I'm going to do 2 classes at once, for example, which in person would simply not be possible to have, 50 odd kids in the gallery all at once, but I can do it on Zoom. So that I think will open things up for us. As a new museum, I have to say we've found it quite difficult because it's coincided with a period when schools' budgets have been shrunk, where schools aren't allowed out so much. And if they are only going to do one trip, they tend to do the safe trip that they've done every year, and they go to the free museum. So the local authority museum is where they go. So we have actually, as a new museum, found it quite hard to break in, particularly with a subject where the word Huguenot, people don't know what that means. And so we've found that quite difficult. But I think we were just starting to make some breakthroughs before lockdown, and I think there are a few things in the pipeline. And I think this is somewhere where the museums that work in this area, us and you and a few others, can probably support each other partly to produce digital materials that will be more easily accessible than the older models, which were physically about the difficulties of getting a whole class in.
Yes, the coach park.
Yeah, all of that. And we're a small museum as well. So a whole school group takes over the entire museum if you've got other visitors in as well. So there are logistical issues.
Because you haven't quite got the Science Museum's generous basement.
Exactly. And the V&A's lunchroom and all of that. Yes, exactly. But we're looking forward to more breakthroughs as we open up.
I was fascinated to learn that there was a child taken into the French hospital. And I would have thought that would be an extraordinary way in for a younger audience. But there are some very good questions, and I don't know if Monica's going to...
I think Monica should take over the reins and feed in the questions.
I've been waiting for the right moment to butt in, because it seemed a great shame to interrupt.
Yeah, no, I was just about to ask you to.
No, such an interesting conversation, and of course it could go on. But yes, there are a wonderfully large number of interesting both comments and questions, and they're flooding in all the time. So one very practical question about the book you mentioned, Dinah. Somebody asking to repeat the details.
Oh, sorry, which book?
Oh gosh, well, it was the one was it David somebody? I should have also registered more. No.
Oh,
Robin Gwynn.
Robin Gwynn.
Oh, Robin Gwynn. Yes, sorry, I did rather throw that in. Robin Gwynn is the sort of preeminent expert on the Huguenots, sort of broadly speaking, in England. There is a single volume book called Huguenot Heritage, which is, as I say, the single volume history of the Huguenots in England. More recently, 2 books go into a far greater detail, and there's going to be a third about the Huguenots in later Stuart England, and I think they're called the Huguenots in later Stuart England. They are available on our website, and I do encourage you to support us if you can, to buy them through the museum. And there is also a book co-authored by Tessa Murdoch, which is the French Hospital in England, which is the history of the French hospital, and lavishly illustrated with many of the objects in the museum, and of course the Huguenot Library as well, where a lot of the documentary evidence is stored.
Lovely. And
You also have Owen Stanwood's book in the shop.
Yes, Stone had Owen Stanwood's excellent book. Oh gosh,
Global Refuge.
Global Refuge, thank you. Very, very good on that broader picture, particularly the Huguenots going out to the United States and the Caribbean and South Africa.
Yes, there was one question about whether the Huguenots went to Haiti, I think.
Yes, I mean, I'll come, Tessa, don't worry, I'll field the question.
Yeah, no, I just thought in the context
No, there are lots
of
of interesting questions. Tessa, tell us just very briefly about your own book. Do you have a definite publication date?
Yes, November. And there will be a launch lecture on the Monday, the 13th of December at the V&A, hosted by the Gilbert Trust, but it's also an event for V&A members. So it would be possible to get tickets through the V&A box office.
Lovely. Dinah, I'm actually just wondering, as you were talking, would you, perhaps it's too much to ask, but if you could compile a brief bibliography and send it to me, then I could circulate it to everybody attending. I think that would be much, much appreciated.
Yeah, no, I'd be delighted to do that.
Would be great. Lovely.
Ladybird version, of course, is in my book as well.
Yes, well, we recommend Bloody Foreigners all the time with great enthusiasm.
Absolutely.
No, you need the experts. You need the experts on top of that.
A whole number of different people asking about the Huguenot presence in other parts of the world. So I think perhaps I could kind of collate them, as it were, for lack of time, into one question. That is, what links have you forged with comparable museums across the world, and how much indeed you know about? I think we've had Ireland mentioned, Haiti, as you say, Holland, Germany as well. So perhaps you could say a little bit about those kind of, continental aspects, international aspects.
Well, I think I'm right in saying that our Huguenot Museum was the last Huguenot museum in the Huguenot diaspora. The other countries that the Huguenots went to have all got museums of one sort or another, and France, I believe, has several. Sadly, we haven't had the time or research budgets to send me to any of these places, but I do hope that will happen soon. So there are Huguenot museums around the place, and I know that we have people here I see on the list from historic Huguenot Street in the United States. There's also the Huguenots in South Carolina. So there are very active Huguenot societies and organizations in all the places where the Huguenots went.
And Huguenot Society of New York has also been represented.
Yes, indeed, exactly.
And there's somebody from Leiden, and also another German Huguenot museum, which I didn't know about. Apart from Berlin.
Yes,
so we
Bad Karlshafen.
Yeah.
So we're very, very keen to develop those links more. It's the trouble of being very young is that that we haven't developed them as much as we would like. But certainly the Huguenot Society in this country has very strong links with many of those organisations and the hospital also. And we have had visits from several groups that have come to the museum from other Huguenot organisations as well.
Great. A question here about a different area of activity. Is there much in the records about Huguenots who were printers? Is that another area that
it is an important area of Huguenot activity, printers of all sorts, and we also hope to have an exhibition of the printmaker Paul Fourdrinier in collaboration with an American collector. Well, he's actually British, but he's based in the United States, which would have been happening later on this year had it not been for COVID, and we hope to get that back on track. And there will be certainly something in our small exhibition about that broader context of the importance of the Huguenots in printmaking. I mean, the Huguenots, of course, were very important in the impetus for the development of print technology. The Protestants, rather, were the impetus for print technology as part of the Reformation is part of that background in which the Huguenots become significant in this country as well.
And also in the late 16th century with Thomas Fortrulli, who's sort of known from Shakespeare context. But in the 18th century, there were a number of French bookshops in the Strand, and the Anglican liturgy translated into French, which you showed by Nicolas Prévost, his shop was in the Strand. So it was very close to the Savoy Church, which of course was a conformist community, and they would have been able to get their prayer books just down the road.
Just to pipe in, there is a rather excellent history of printing museum in Basel, in Switzerland, which features all the long history, and a lot of them is Protestant publishing during the Reformation. So it will definitely have some Huguenot printers in there.
Yeah.
And a question about fans from the curator of the Fan Museum, Jacob Moss. Super talk. Does the museum feature any handheld fans attributed to Huguenot makers in its displays?
There's nothing from the French Hospital collection. We have on loan a fan from someone relating to the French Hospital, as it were, who, now I'm trying to remember because it was on display just before I joined. I don't think the fan maker would have been Huguenot. I think the owner was Huguenot, and it's related to an important Huguenot family who also has Canadian connections, and exactly where the fan fits in, I'm afraid I can't remember, but I could probably find out and see if there's anything there. But other than that, I don't think there's anything fan related that I'm aware of. Perhaps
I could just mention that Jacob Moss, the curator who asked that question,
yeah,
is giving a talk on Huguenot fan makers for the Huguenots of Spitalfields on July the 22nd. It's not yet on their website because I tried to register for it, but he was too modest to tell us about that. But anybody listening who's interested in Huguenots and fans, that is.
Yes, the Huguenots of Spitalfields is a really useful resource, isn't it? A useful website to know about. A very practical question regarding the funding of this lavish, particularly the second, the French hospital, where, what was the money behind it?
Off the top of my head, it must have been funds raised from the Huguenot community itself. I mean, I know the architect of the new building waived his fee. He was of Huguenot descent himself, so that will have saved a fair bit of money. Huguenot, Tessa, as co-author of the book, can
such a good question, and I don't have the answer off pat, and I'm not sure we really looked into it, because they would have needed to purchase the land on which is quite a considerable amount. I think Dinah didn't mention that building still survives, and ironically became a Catholic school, but is now part of the Hackney Mossbourne Academy group, and is a school, and they are very interested in their heritage. So again, there's a wonderful partnership, waiting to develop between the school and the French hospital, and the Huguenot Museum really as a catalyst to develop that interest. There are all sorts of wonderful stories, like apparently there are two elderly ladies that are sometimes seen sitting on the staircase at the school. So Huguenot ghosts, a little bit of creativity, I think, could bring much of that to life.
Fascinating. Somebody asking about the connection with Rochester. Why Rochester?
Yes, I glossed over that quickly, didn't I? Because I knew I was running out of time. Essentially, after the Second World War, the French hospital moved out to the name of the place escapes me, in Sussex. That's it. I was going to say Compton Verney, and I knew that wasn't right. Compton's Lee, and everything was sort of shrinking, and they needed a sort of reboot. So they were looking for a new site. And that square that I showed the picture of, which looks purpose-built for almshouses, was a residential square that they found. The Bishop of Rochester at the time was Christopher Chavasse, the brother of Noel Chavasse, who you may have come across, the double VC from the First World War, and they were both Olympic athletes, extraordinary family. And he was a director of the French hospital, so there was that connection there as well. And so they bought that site, and it was renamed La Providence. And there's a lovely quote where they say that they've restored an eyesore because it was really decrepit. I mean, we still have people coming in who remember visiting Auntie so-and-so who used to live there, and it was all falling down. They're saying they're hoping they restored this eyesore, and they were hoping it would bring tourists from far and wide, which of course was in the minds of the directors of the French hospital when they set the museum up as well.
I'm aware of time rolling on, and we should probably begin. It's absolutely fascinating. We could go on for much longer, but perhaps one last direct question yes, a question. It would be interesting to identify if Gainsborough and other portrait artists of the 18th century and conversation piece artists included Huguenot textiles and objects in their paintings.
Yes, they must have done. I can't think of an example. Tessa will know better than me.
Well, I was going to say the wonderful Natalie Rothstein, whose life work was researching and writing and publishing about Huguenot silk weavers, identified a number of portraits of ladies wearing Spitalfield silks, and I think that source, her amazing research, also demonstrates that some of those portraits were of Americans, colonial Americans wearing Spitalfield silk. So there was a huge export market for these flowered silks, designed and woven by Huguenots and others as well. And particular places where you would expect to find them would be Charleston, where there's still a very active Huguenot Society of South Carolina, and Jamaica, for example. They were the sort of the richest market for British exports, and they also sent their sons back to Britain to develop culture and polish according to the expectations of those times. So wearing the right clothes was part of that language of, I suppose, gentility.
One of the favourite stories I came upon a long time ago now, and perhaps was in some ways apocryphal, was that some of the Huguenot weavers who set up making felt on the very, very clean River Wandle, which is now Wandsworth, and there's a Huguenot place there to commemorate their presence and so forth. They were very good dyers, and they specialized in a new dye that's come from Brazil, and they made this incredibly brilliant scarlet. And that became very popular for making the cardinals' hats in Rome, which led to that magnificent irony that the cardinals' hats of the Catholic Church in the Vatican were being made by refugee French Protestants in South London.
That's right. It's a brilliant story, isn't it? I have just remembered as well also about the question of Spitalfield silk in portraits, is that there's a brilliant book by the American historian Zara Annis Anslin about a portrait of a woman wearing a Spitalfield silk dress. And we know the sitter, we know the painter, we know the designer was Anna Maria Garthwaite, and we know who wove the silk as well. And the book, I mean, it's the most fabulous, how one object can tell so many stories. And the book is called Portrait of a Woman in Silk and is available through the Huguenot Museum shop.
The book list is clearly needed. Thanks, Dinah. Perhaps there's so many questions, interesting comments. What about the Courtauld family? I mean, how consciously Huguenot did it remain?
Oh, I don't know how consciously Huguenot they remained. I mean, they're incredibly important, aren't they? And Braintree just did an exhibition just before lockdown about the importance of the Courtaulds to that area. I don't know, Tessa.
There was a fascinating exhibition in Paris 2 years ago about the Courtauld legacy. I mean, really an opportunity to showcase the Courtauld Institute collection, which of course was acquired by Samuel Courtauld, who was a direct descendant. And I think there was an attempt to try and identify why it was that Samuel Courtauld was collecting French Impressionists. Was this sort of buying into the culture that was represented by his ancestors? But there are huge quantities of material about the Courtauld family. But I don't know, about 12 books at least, their role as silversmiths for 3 generations. And there was one question about speaking French still in the late 18th century. And that compendium for the Paris exhibition underlines the fact that Louisa Courtauld, who was in fact born an Augier, part of a leading silk weaving merchant family in Spitalfields, spoke French to her grandchildren. in the last quarter of the 18th century.
Mm.
And the portraits that Diana showed of John Jacob and his wife Anne Courtauld, both Anne and John wrote their wills in French in the 1780s.
Mm.
So it demonstrates, although the Augiers actually came over in, I think, 1729, that they wanted to retain their identity. And I think one of the big questions is, what about all those confiscated estates in France?
Mm-hmm.
Was there a later attempt to try and claim restitution when Edict of Toleration was signed by Louis XVI in 1787?
And
There's so much talk about restitution today.
Yeah,
what are the issue?
Do you not know the answer to that question? Is there no evidence? Must be.
Well, we know David Viaume, one of the leading Huguenot goldsmiths of the first generation, sent his son back to Metz in the 17 teens about some family inheritance. But it's very complex because members of the same family would have remained in France and abjured their Protestant faith, at least nominally, and would have appeared, as the French describe them, as nouveaux convertis. But how deep was that conversion? And some of the most recent research, and Sandra Robinson, who I think is listening, has done some remarkable research on the family of the celebrated sculptor Roubiliac. But his father left Lyon with the family in, I think, about 1712, and went to Frankfurt, where the family joined the Protestant church. And yet the famous sculptor Louis Roubiliac was baptized a Catholic because that was the only option in the early 1700s. So it's extremely complicated, and presumably many families maintained their estates by ensuring that some members of the family did indeed become nouveau convertis.
Which immediately puts me in mind, Tessa, of the Marano phenomenon in Spain. I mean, maybe this is the time to start drawing a few parallels, and one again could go on about that a lot, but a lot of what you've said, Dinah, and Tessa too, resonates strongly with the Jewish experience. Not that there is one homogeneous, phenomenon, but nevertheless, the sort of change in language use, the urge to assimilate and then to rediscover your roots, and many other things besides. But the thing that struck me particularly is something you said, I think, right at the beginning, and then possibly repeated again, is that there is a tendency today, and this I think holds true for the mostly Jewish refugees from Nazism who came here in the 1930s, that because they have been disproportionately successful in all manner of different, terrains, that it's very easy for migrants and refugees now to say or to forget about the darkness of the experiences that made them make the journey to these shores. And I think that's really, really important. There's, there's a sort of almost a moral kind of point to make by way of conclusion.
Prosperity doesn't change the psychological difficulty.
No, absolutely not. Exactly. And I think the issues remain, they're sort of constant sort of leitmotifs. And I think that's all the more reason, Robert, why, what you're doing at the Migration Museum is so important, to make the links between past experiences and much more recent ones, indeed contemporary ones. And I suppose also with the Huguenots, it's far enough in the past, isn't it, that there are fewer emotions swirling about, shall we say, in terms of what we might make of, those comparisons. Excellent. Gosh, well, lots of informed comments. And what I can do, if you like, Dinah, indeed Tessa, is send you a transcript of the chat. It might be useful, perhaps, because there
would be very useful.
Nuggets of information.
Wonderful feedback. Actually.
Lovely, absolutely.
Lovely to have such a engaged audience. And I would again like to thank Dinah for stepping into the breach with such alacrity and such brilliance. Thank you.
Skill. And night is falling in Rochester.
I know. I do. If I get up to turn the light on, I'll tip everything over.
It's time to call it.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm managing to pick up some of the comments now. Thank you very much for very informed and interesting responses.
And also lots of people saying, we know we have some Huguenot ancestry. We're going to find out more. We want to find out more. Yes,
excellent.
Lots of interest.
Look forward to talking to you.
Good, Dinah. Thanks ever so much for stepping into the fray so admirably. Tessa, thank you. And perhaps we could persuade you to talk later in the year about your book, which focuses
I'd be delighted to do
on
that.
culture. I would love that to happen. And Robert,
Yeah.
thanks ever so much. And as I say, Robert's book is absolutely fabulous. Bloody Foreigners, great.
Thank you.
I'm
Pleasure.
looking forward to
Okay,
Robert's
all the
latest
best, everyone. Thank you for
book,
being
Fire,
such
too.
an
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much.
Oh,
Bye.
actually, sorry, let me just one last thing. I was asked at the very beginning, is this being recorded? Yes, it is. And the place to find the recording, but I will also send the link, both, well, to all three of the speakers, will be on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, which you can find pretty easily simply by Googling it, which, though I say it myself, is becoming a quite rich resource of recordings on themes related, sometimes directly, sometimes, as in this case, indirectly to the theme of the Insiders Outsiders project. So give us a few days to get it up there, but that's where you'll find the recording. Okay, good night, everyone. All the best.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.